Good afternoon and welcome to the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit. Our webinar today is looking for solid data on service members and veterans. MCMC has you covered. My name is Sarah Appel and I am the project coordinator for the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit, an initiative of the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. And we're not able to do a lot of the work that we do or are working on without special thanks to Lumina Foundation and USA funds. Just to give you a brief overview, the mission of the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit is to facilitate an interstate partnership of 13 states and to translate competencies acquired by veterans through military training and experiences toward college credentials. States will exchange information and share best practices in the areas of articulation of credit, certification and licensure, communication, and data and technology. Our project goals: to assist student veterans with completing post-secondary education and the transition into civilian employment. MCMC has established the following 3 goals. Assist with critical life transitions from the military to post-secondary education and then from post-secondary education to the civilian workforce or civilian employment. Increase post-secondary education completion rates by creating models for the consistent, transparent, and effective awarding of credit for military training and experience that can be scaled regionally and nationally, thereby lowering the cost of education and reducing the time to completion. Establish a strong network of support, communication, documentation, and data among institutions and organizations for the purpose of promoting shared interests and tracking the efficacy of efforts to enhance service members' educational success. And we do all this work through 4 work groups: articulation of academic credit, licensure and certification, communication and outreach, data systems, and technology. And now I'm going to turn it over to the licensure and certification co-chairs.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Jennifer Timmons, and I am one of the co-chairs for the Licensure and Certification Committee, and I am from the University of Iowa. My co-chair is Carla Wiscombe from the Kansas Board of Regents, and so today I'll be talking to you briefly about the goals of our subcommittee, and Carla will be working later. She'll be moderating the questions at the end of each session. So if you have any questions, please post those in the chat room, and Carla will be collecting those and we'll answer those as we go along. But welcome and thank you all for joining our call today. For the Licensure and Certification Work Group, we have several goals. One of those is to address the absence of common standards for service credentialing programs and inconsistent state laws, addressing the lack of understanding about how military training and experience translate into licensing and academic credentials, and extending the results of the existing national efforts to all states in the MCMC. And today we have MCMC is partnering with SOLID, and we have with us 2 members from SOLID who are going to help us gain a greater understanding and access to the military data that they have been providing to us. And so I'd like to turn it over to Lisa and Ed, and thank you for your presentation today.
Great. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good afternoon to everyone on the line, or I guess morning for those who have joined from the Pacific time zone. Ed and I are very pleased to be here today. My company is called SOLID, and we specialize in policy research and analysis with an emphasis on translating military training and experience into civilian jobs and civilian credentials. And Ed and I have been doing work in this area going back about 20 years now. We do work for the Department of Defense, each of the military services, the Department of Labor, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and more recently we worked with the National Governors Association, and we have been very pleased to be supporting the MCMC initiative. We're very excited about the work that MCMC is doing. It really is an indicator of how far we've come in this arena. As I said, we've been doing work for about 20 years in credentialing of service members, and I can tell you the times have changed. When we first started working in this area, the military services and the Department of Defense were brought to the table very grudgingly. They didn't understand why they would want to try to facilitate licensure or certification of a service member. They assumed that that would be like giving a service member a ticket out of the service. Well, their thinking on that has really evolved over time, and I think this is illustrated by the emphasis that we've all seen on credentialing of service members and veterans in recent years. The services now embrace this as both a recruiting and a retention tool, but most importantly, they also see it as a way to professionalize their workforce. So they're actually encouraging service members to attain a lot of civilian credentials while they're on active duty. Most recently, the emphasis on credentialing of service members has been related to transition. Clearly, with the downsizing of the military, numbers of folks going into the civilian workforce, they're trying to find ways to ease their transition and make it a seamless transition, and credentialing is seen as one of those methods. The efforts that we have seen over time have traditionally focused at the national level, so it's very exciting to us to see these state initiatives. And our focus today is going to be on 4 topics. We wanted to start by giving you sort of a high-level 50,000-foot view of credentialing as it relates to service members and veterans, with a particular emphasis on state licensing. We have been participating in a number of different initiatives, one recently completed by the National Governors Association, and we've had the opportunity to learn a lot from these experiences, and we want to share some of that learning with you in order to give you a context for the broader discussion, which is really focused on the data that we've been gathering and analyzing for MCMC. So the first part of our presentation will give you that high-level overview. Next, we'll talk about 3 different topics related to the data. And we've kind of divided it into the types of data that we've analyzed. And the first type of data is really looking at the number of military personnel in various military occupations and identifying their the most closely matched civilian job. The second piece is looking at civilian labor market trends for the related civilian occupations to get some sense of what the demand is for employment in those different civilian occupational areas. And then the third piece is we're using some of the national separations data that we were able to collect from the Department of Defense to help you all in the states estimate the number of folks at the state level in the various occupations. Slide 12 here is intended to give you a high-level overview from a state's perspective of some of the key steps that are involved in facilitating licensure of service members. Step 1 is really the step that's focused primarily on the data that we'll be discussing today. And the key here is identifying the target military and civilian occupations. As you can imagine, across the 50 states and X number of territories, the number and the types of occupational licenses that are offered are going to vary dramatically. So states may want to take different approaches to which occupational areas they select initially in order to get the most bang for their buck. So while there are some broad steps that can be taken to facilitate licensure across all occupational areas, we've found in general that different types of occupations pose different challenges for service members and veterans in terms of being able to attain the license. And a lot of that is driven by the types of requirements. We want to obviously target the occupational licenses that are associated with military occupations for which you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck. So an example I like to give is the state of Maine, not one of the MHEC states, of course, actually licenses marine worm diggers. Well, if you don't want to spend a lot of effort looking at a license in your state like the worm diggers, because clearly there's not going to be a whole lot of service members in that occupation, and the demand for that occupation in the civilian sector is probably not very high. So we'll hopefully help you make some targeted decisions about what occupations to pursue. The second step is to identify your licensure requirements. As I said, the types of requirements really drive the ability of a service member to meet the requirements, which is what we would assess in step 3. And then finally, once you've kind of gotten the lay of the land and understand the requirements and how service members may or may not be able to meet them, state licensing agencies and related stakeholders can make some policy decisions about how they might be able to facilitate licensing. When we look at various types of credentialing requirements, and this is true for both licensure and certification, we can broadly identify 4 types of requirements. The first is education or training, and that may be a degree. It might be you have to have completed a certain number of semester hours. It might be that you will have participated in a program that's been accredited by a third party. So all of those things lead to different challenges for service members, and we'll talk about that more specifically. Another common type of credential requirement is work experience. And sometimes that could be just as broad as you will have related professional or work experience. You might have to have experience with specific types of job responsibilities or working under the supervision of a certain type of person. And we'll talk about the implications of those types of requirements for service members. And the exam requirement is typical for almost any credential. There's going to be some sort of an assessment mechanism. Exams are the most common type of assessment mechanism, and they might be written exams. It could be an oral or a practical exam. And the other category is just kind of a catch-all category and can be quite varied depending on the occupational area. But some of the most common ones that you see across occupational areas are residency requirements within the state and continuing education or renewal requirements. I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive now into the various types of education requirements, how that might affect the military, and what kinds of policy considerations the stakeholders could consider in order to alleviate any barriers related to that particular type of requirement. So as I mentioned, a degree is a very common requirement for some types of occupational licenses. When we focus on credentialing of service members and veterans, our focus is primarily on the enlisted personnel rather than on the officers. And this is because enlisted personnel typically gain almost all of their relevant occupational training and experience through the military, unlike their civilian counterparts who may have attended a college or university or a more traditional civilian training program. These folks are going to get establish their competency actually based in the military. Most enlisted service members do not have higher degrees, but many have accumulated college credit based on their military training or voluntary education, and some of them have attained degrees. The most recent statistic I've seen is that about 82% of enlisted personnel do not have a higher degree. So with regard to the degree requirement, some of the things that policy considerations that a licensing agency might consider is defining an alternate pathway to meeting the degree requirements. So for example, you might say you could have an associate's degree and 4 years of experience, a bachelor's degree and 2 years of experience, and you might even say we would accept no degree with 6 years of experience. Military personnel have typically many, many years of very important military experience accumulated, so that gives them more options for being able to qualify. And then clearly the other piece of it is you can recognize military training and experience towards degree requirements and develop bridge programs when there are gaps between, when the individual has not actually attained the degree. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that can be done in a minute. The second type of education and training requirement that we've focused on here is accredited or approved course or training program. I will say that some military training programs are accredited by a third party. You're going to see this primarily in the medical arena, and some of the recent work that MCMC has done with CALE, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, has really kind of put a focus on some of the good things that are going on with regard to the medical training in the military and the fact that it's getting greater recognition by third-party accreditors and by post-secondary institutions. What some of the policy considerations related to accredited or approved training: you can accept the third-party program accreditation in lieu of state approval. It's very difficult for a military training program to work with individual states to ensure that it gets approved by each state. So if a state's licensing requirements rely on a third-party program accreditor, it'll make it easier for the military to meet that requirement, that national requirement. Again, you can assess military training and grant full or partial recognition if you do have your own approved training program. And if you only have partial recognition, again, we encourage the development of bridge programs, but the recognition of military training as well. And then the last educational type of requirement is the number of college credit hours. As I said, most service members will have some college credit earned either through a civilian institution or recommended through the American Council on Education. The American Council on Education reviews military training and experience for the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps and recommends specific amounts of college credit for each type of training. In the Air Force, they have, many of you may be aware, an institution called the Community College of the Air Force, which is actually an accredited accredited community college. So they can actually award credit much like any other community college would award credit. So what we're encouraging here is for state licensing agencies and institutes of higher education to look at the ACE credit recommendations and the CCAF awarded credit and hopefully accept those towards their requirements. So that's kind of how education requirements, some of the implications of education requirements on service members. With regard to experience requirements, as I alluded to, military experience is often very relevant to civilian credentialing requirements. In some areas, the military folks get exposed to a much broader array of experiences than even their civilian counterparts would. A lot of the experience that a service member brings to the table is actually documented on official transcripts. So we encourage state licensing agencies and other stakeholders who might be evaluating military experience to look at the types of formal documentation that are available to them, the various transcripts, the DD-214 some of you may have heard of, that are actually issued by the services, and use that in order to make some of your determinations regarding the relevance of the experience. This is considerations related to exam requirements. As I said, almost every license is going to have an exam component. Some state licensing agencies are able to rely on a national exam. So we give two examples here. One is the National Registry for Emergency Medical Technicians, which offers a national certification for EMTs, and that certification exam is recognized by many state agencies. The NCLEX is the nursing equivalent, the national exam that's recognized by many state licensing agencies in the nursing arena. WAVE exams, many of you may be aware of a recent initiative where in order to attain the commercial driver's license, now every state in the country has agreed to waive the exam requirements for the skills test. So, working with the AMVA, which is the Association of Automotive Vehicle Administrators, they were able to assess military training and experience in a way that the states felt comfortable that it was enough to allow service members to be exempt from having to take the skills test. There could be additional opportunities there. Another option is to provide an abbreviated exam for military-trained applicants. Sometimes the state portion of an exam is really, or sometimes state exams are very close to a national exam, and the only portions that are different are the state-specific, maybe regulations, that kind of thing. So perhaps you'd be able to waive the bulk of the exam but have the service member take the state requirements only. And there are precedents in states for doing that. And then certainly the other piece of it is if there is an exam required, help them identify exam preparation resources. This last slide with regard to the requirements, the other types of requirements that I mentioned, residency, service members clearly are very mobile and will have a difficult time establishing residency requirements. You might consider waiving that requirement or granting provisional licensure. With regard to continuing education and or renewal requirements, what we've learned is that there are a lot of folks who may hold a license, but they're deployed, and when they're in theater, they don't have an opportunity to meet the continuing education requirements. And we've actually seen states who have allowed a grace period for deployed service members. Those are all just sort of some high-level considerations related to how the specific requirements for an occupational license might have different implications for the military folks and what kinds of policy considerations you would want to take into account. This next slide is intended to do a few things. First of all, it's intended to show you the number of different stakeholders who play a role in state licensure. Clearly, probably the number one thing that we have learned over all of the years working in this area, and that I suspect if you've been doing this for any amount of time, you've gathered the same conclusion, and that is credentialing of service members is complex. It's not a black and white issue. It's not as simple as the military adapting its training or as simple as a civilian agency, accepting wholesale military training and experience. There are a lot of different stakeholders who are involved in making decisions that could affect the ability of a service member to attain a state license. I will say that the military who has come out really in favor, as I indicated earlier, of credentialing of service members, they also are not asking for a one-for-one transference between military training and a civilian license or a certification. They recognize that at times there are legitimate gaps between the military training and experience and the civilian credentialing requirements. What they want is to maximize the credit for the training that the service member does have, so that they can they're precluded from having to repeat training or demonstrate experience that has attained outside of the military. So at the end of each of these segments, and I'm covering the first 3 segments, which I meant to mention to you earlier, I thought I'd open it up to questions. So before I move on, are there any questions about that sort of policy overview of civilian credentialing? So since we don't have any yet, I'll go ahead and move on, but we can certainly move back to that topic if anybody has questions. So as I said, the next 3 segments of our webinar are going to address the data that has been collected to support the MCMC initiative. And the first piece of data that we want to talk about is the strengths and the separations related to military occupations and their related civilian jobs, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So we have worked with the Department of Defense, the Defense Manpower Data Collection Center, to gather information on the numbers of service members in different military occupations in terms of their strengths, which is the number of people who are in the service at a given point in time. And for this particular data poll, it was for September 30th of 2015, which was the last day of fiscal year 15. And the number of separations, or the number of service members who left the service during FY 2015. And what we did is, once we've identified all of the military occupations that are relevant, we identified their most related civilian occupation. Many military occupations could be related to numerous different civilian occupations, but for the purpose of this analysis, we were looking at the civilian occupation that would be considered most related. And we look at that by ONET code, and I expect most of you are familiar with that term, but the ONET is basically a civilian occupational classification system that the Department of Labor sponsors, and it's used to classify all private sector civilian occupations. So our research was to link the military occupations, of which there were over 700, to various civilian occupations, and I believe I've got that on another slide, but there were about 170 unique civilian occupations. We did a little more in-depth analysis of the healthcare military occupations, and for your benefit, when I say MOC, it's Military Occupation Code, which is the broad terminology that's used to cover all all military occupational specialties. Each service calls them something a little bit different. In the Army, it's an MOS, or a military occupational specialty, as it is in the Marine Corps. The Air Force has Air Force specialty codes, and the Navy, at least for the enlisted folks, calls them ratings. So just to make your life a little bit complicated, or to simplify your life, we're going to refer to them as MOCs. So with the healthcare MOCs, a lot of those are grouped by the service at one very high level. So for example, the Navy's enlisted military medical healthcare occupations are all categorized as hospital corpsmen. And so a lot of the data that's collected on a routine basis at DoD is at that level. However, there's over 30 different occupational specialty areas that are part of the hospital corpsmen. So you'll have everything from dental assistants, dental hygienists, radiologic technicians, just the gamut of types of healthcare occupations. So we got data from DoD that was at a more detailed level for the healthcare MOCs, so that we could present to you better information about the specialty areas. And then finally, some of the high-level data was broken out by active duty and Guard and Reserve. We're going to be talking more about totals, though, today. So the next 2 slides actually show you the top 25 civilian jobs that were related to military occupations, and they're in order of, in a descending order, sorry. So the first one that's listed there is infantry, and you can see that that row is grayed out. There are some military occupations that do not directly translate into a civilian occupation. And the Department of Labor categorizes them in an ONET job family called military specific. So infantry is clearly one of those. So for the purpose of this analysis, we didn't attempt to identify some of the potential civilian occupations that an infantryman might qualify for, and that's something that is underway, but we're focused more on the civilian occupational equivalents that are directly related to the military occupations. So if we're translating this table, looking at the second row, police patrol officers, we would basically interpret this by saying that there were 13,693 separating service members in FY15 who held a military occupation that was equivalent to the police patrol officers, and that represented about 4.84% of the total number of people, enlisted people transitioning in FY15. So the data that we have provided to MCMC provides much more information on not just the top 25, but on all of the related civilian occupations to account for all of the enlisted personnel. What you can see, though, I've just moved forward to slide 22, if you're looking just at the top 25 related civilian jobs, that represents 63% of all of the individuals transitioning out of the military in FY15, which is a very large proportion. So if you concentrated your efforts only on the top 25 or maybe went just a little bit further to the top 50, you are going to have captured a large number of the transitioning military personnel. What we did here is we separated it out to show you if you were looking at, if you didn't include the military-specific occupations, you're still looking at 43% of the entire number of separations in FY15. Okay. And again, there were about 800 military occupations that matched to about 170 unique ONET codes. So let's see, I think we might have a couple of questions. So we've got one question. I reviewed the ONET codes and have some concerns that a senior non-commissioned officer, such as a first sergeant, is considered to be the equivalent of a first-line supervisor. That equivalency isn't correct. Are there military members included in this discussion of equivalency? So the answer to that is yes. The initial crosswalk that has done between the military occupations and the civilian occupations is actually done by the Defense Manpower Data Center. And they basically review the military occupational duties, and each of the services are required to report to Department of Defense on, I believe it's a quarterly basis, if not semi-annual, their job duties. And then they have somebody within DMDC who's making an assessment as to what would be the closest civilian occupational match. We utilized their crosswalk for the purpose of this data pull. My company does support some other initiatives where we've done a deeper dive into looking at related civilian occupations, and we've been able to identify some additional civilian occupational matches. Some of you may have heard of the Services Cool programs or Credentialing Opportunities Online Cool programs. In those programs, we've matched every enlisted military occupation to anywhere from 1 to 5 or more civilian occupations, and we've categorized the match between the military occupation and the civilian occupation in terms of whether the two match, most of the duties match on the military side and the civilian side, or some of the duties match. And we can provide access to more information about that. We also have a question about are the data available by state. And we'll be getting to that in the third segment of the webinar. And I think I've addressed the questions so far. So let me move on. So the next subject we wanted to talk about is, now that we've identified the civilian occupational matches, we also looked into some key civilian labor market indicators. We wanted to know, of the civilian occupational matches, which ones are most likely going to be in demand in the civilian workforce. So as the chairperson noted in the chat window, the Excel files that we used for this analysis are actually available and are linked from the MCMC resources page, and she's posted a link in the chat window for that. When you look at the Excel files, you'll see a tab that deals with civilian labor market information, and we provide information on whether it's a bright outlook occupation. In other words, it looks like it's going to have continued employment growth or high numbers of individuals in those jobs, whether it's considered a green occupation. We provide information on the ONET job zone. For those of you who are not familiar, the ONET categorizes every civilian job into 5 different job zones, or into one of 5 different job zones that range from job zone 1, showing very little preparation needed for that civilian occupation, to job zone 5, where occupations would need extensive preparation, which would likely include a degree and possibly some years of experience. And all of these are defined in the data dictionary that accompanies the workbook that we've provided the link to. I think most of the rest are relatively self-explanatory. The next slide just kind of gives you a sense of how the data are portrayed in the workbook. So you can see for every ONET code how we've characterized the various civilian labor market considerations. And I believe, unless there are questions here, I will now turn it over to Ed Davin to address our final segment. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today. As Lisa said, she and I have been involved in this area of third-party certification and licensure of service members and veterans for quite a number of years, and so it really is an area that we really care about and enjoy talking to people about. And I get the further benefit of being able to talk to you about some data supplied by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and what we can do about it. And I do have my moments when I'm a data geek. So my hope today is to use my data geek skills to explain the data in a way that makes sense to you. So I, again, encourage you, as a question occurs to you, please put it in the chat window, and we'll be happy to answer it for you. So as the title here says, we're going to take some national separations data and use them in conjunction with BLS data to estimate state-level separations. And before we go any further, I want you to put quotation marks on the front and the back of estimate. And we may say estimate, we may say allocate, we may say project, we may say various things to qualify the specificity. This is simply, given current constraints, the best that can be done that we know of. And another word that we could use that I particularly like is approximate. So we're really talking about coming up for you with the best reasonable approximations we could of how national data on separations translate to the state level. And before we go further, one other thing I will say, I think Lisa and I have learned from experience, you look at a national separations number standing there by itself, and you say, wow, that's a big number. Well, then you take a matrix of 50 states in one direction, and on that matrix you put those 170 occupations in the other axis. Suddenly, you go to any cell on that matrix, and the numbers get very small. So, I'm not to say all the numbers are small. There are certainly military specialties that are large, where even at the state level, there are quite a few separations. But numbers that look very big in mass and at the national level get much smaller at the state level, and smaller still if you break them out by military specialty. So we're going to step through 3 types of data that we really used the last 2, but the first 2 are presented here for context and perspective. All of the data that we're going to use here are data that are provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Not everybody who's interested in veterans thinks that the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the best for their purposes. Social workers, gerontologists, sociologists, demographers, they may be more interested in data that the VA keeps on veterans. But for our purposes here, what we're really interested in certification and licensure for is for civilian employment. So if you're interested in civilian employment of veterans, then BLS is the source for data. And BLS does a very good job, not just at providing data on the U.S. economy and the U.S. labor force as a whole. They do a very good job of collecting, compiling, and distributing as much data as they can on veterans. So, first of all, we will talk first of all about BLS data on number of veterans in the U.S. population. VA would probably have a different number for reasons we'll mention. And then we'll talk about the number of veterans in the civilian labor force for each MCMC state and for the region. And then we're going to talk about the number of post-9/11 era veterans in the civilian labor force for each MCMC state and the region. And those are the best benchmarks that we have to estimate for you in a given year, and this year, in this case, the given year is 2015, to estimate for you how many of the service members who separated in 2015 might have made the decision to return to your state. So let's start at the top. BLS provides estimates of the adult population 18 and older. We'll get to the 18 part down the way because that relates to the civilian labor force. But for now, just observe, we are only talking population 18 and older. We're not interested in people under 18. So if we look at all adults 18 and older, we see 241,949,000. And how many veterans are in that population? 21,209,000. Well, who are these people? This is the civilian, non-institutional population of the United States. Because it's the civilian population, it does not include military service members. Because it is the non-institutional population, it doesn't include prisoners, and it probably doesn't include long-term residents of nursing homes. But it's just an interesting thing to note. People talk about the veterans being a small share of the U.S. population, and they are a diminishing share. But when we're talking the adult population 18 and over, the U.S. population is still 9% veteran. There have been times in the past when it was 10, 11, 12%. That was when many World War II, Korean, and Vietnam era veterans, the conscription eras, when veterans from the conscription eras were still in the population, the veteran percentages were higher. And so the veteran percentages are declining. All right, more relevant for us, but I just like to establish that benchmark, that our population, the civilian non-institutional population, is 9% veteran. When we come to the civilian labor force, those people who are employed plus those people who are unemployed. That is the definition of the civilian labor force. And to be considered unemployed, you have to be available to go to work and seeking work. And so if you are not currently employed, and you are also not currently available for work and not seeking employment, you are considered out of the civilian labor force. Common people in that category are students who are full-time, retirees who don't choose to work any longer, and you hear a lot of times on the news about the discouraged workers, the people who've been unemployed for so long they just give up. And they say, I'm not available for work, I'm not looking for a job, I give up. Well, they're not in the civilian labor force. To be in the civilian labor force, you got to either have one or want one. So now we notice the numbers drop down from 241 million to 155 million for the whole population. And for veterans, it's almost half, from 21 plus to, a little bit over 10 million. Now that we're into the civilian labor force, the percent veteran has dropped 2% to 7%. Obviously, the population of retired people in the country has a higher veteran population than 6.9, and I think we can assume higher than 8.8. So now we are in the civilian labor force, and we see the veterans in the civilian labor force. BLS also compiles data on veterans by era. They have World War II era, not that many are still out there, if any. They have Korean era, and there are people still working from the Korean era. They have the Vietnam era. They have a sort of a non-era between Vietnam and the first Gulf War. And they have what BLS calls Gulf War I, which is from, I believe, the time that we invaded Iraq under President Bush the First. I think that runs up until what BLS calls Gulf War II. But other than BLS, most people call what BLS calls Gulf War II, most of the rest of us call the post-9/11 era. So as it says in the first bullet, you're going to see estimates of how many veterans are in the civilian labor force in your state, and they could be of any era, and it's just an indicator of the extent to which veterans are sharing in and contributing to the civilian economy in each state. They also have these estimates of post-9/11 era veterans in the civilian labor force. Obviously, that is not all veterans. It is just those who separated since September 11, 2001. That estimate, the post-9/11 era veteran, is the best national benchmark. Let's put it this way. It's the best nationally available benchmark about veterans at the state level that we have available to us for allocating the national separations numbers by state, because that is the best indicator that we have of the likelihood that recent veterans will choose to reside in a given state. And if we jump ahead, I think the numbers maybe help make that clear. There is each of the MCMC states. In the left-hand column is the total number of veterans in the civilian labor force. That's everybody who's a veteran in your states who is either working or looking for a job. In the right-hand column, we have the number of post-9/11 era veterans in your states in 2015. And all of these are BLS data from 2015. And all of the BLS data we are looking at today are calendar year data. And all the military data we've been looking at are fiscal year data. So there's a slight time frame difference. The military data ended on September 30, 2015. The BLS data ended on December 31, 2015. If you look at the totals, you will see a short indication of why we use post-9/11 era veterans as the allocation for the separations. You will see that the MCMC states account for 22.5% of all veterans, but they only account for 19.9% of post-9/11 era veterans. The reason for that is, I think it's pretty well known that there has been, in recent decades, a demographic shift in this country away from northern states and toward southern states. And if you were seeing this very same type of display for, let's say, either the southeast or the southwest of the United States, you would see those columns reversed. You would see that the total veterans percentage would be lower than the post-9/11 era veteran, which would be higher. So this table shows you why we chose to use post-9/11 era veterans as the benchmark to project how many of the separations might be going to your states. If we had used all veterans, we would be overestimating how many veterans would be going to your state. We'd be overestimating by that difference of 2.6% over 20%. So I mean, proportionally, we'd probably tell you that the number of veterans separating in your state are 10% higher than what would have been a better estimate that we do have to provide to you. All right, so we understand post-9/11 era veterans. During fiscal 15, we had 282,707 service members separate from the service. We won't try to tell you the many stories about the second bullet. The Department of Defense does keep data about people. They know where they lived when they signed up to go to the military. And they probably have a pretty good idea of what state service members claim as their state of legal residence while they're in the military. But once the service member leaves the military, the Department of Defense does not really have a clue. Interestingly, though, they do make it possible for veterans to leave a clue. So let's just start by saying that the point of the second bullet is we can't go to the Department of Defense and tell you where the veterans went, because if we could, we would. If we could have, we would have, but we couldn't. So there's no good answer. There's no precise, accurate, defensible answer of how many veterans went to your respective states. The Department of Defense does give a service member an opportunity. When they fill out their discharge form, the DD-214, they may check a box at the bottom to say, you have my permission to send information about me to the State Department of Veterans Affairs in X state. Now, a service member doesn't have to check that box, number one. Number two, they don't necessarily have to check the box of the state they're going to go to. They could check Michigan today and decide to go to Florida tomorrow. But at least they leave, you might say, some of them at least leave a mark in the sand about where it appeared that they would be going. The Department of Defense, and when they check that form, they're giving the Department of Defense permission to turn that data, including their name, personal information about them, what rank they served at, what specialty they served in, and I think they're also allowed to list, a likely address. And so, and the Department of Defense does, in fact, turn that information over to the State Departments of Veterans Affairs. Unfortunately, they turn it over as PDF files. So it is automated to the extent that it is a PDF file, but it is not automated as in a database that you can search, query, and get information from. Essentially, every state gets huge collections of PDF files that they can figure out what to do with. Now, from what I understand, they are accessible or scannable PDF files, so the states can use that information, and some states do. And for those of you who are working with veterans in a state, you definitely want to find out what your State Department of Veterans Affairs does with that data or doesn't do. And we have heard about states that have it all automated, and we have heard about states who have it all stacked in paper form in a back room. So it's going to vary considerably by state. That would be a much better source than anything we can give you today if it's available in your state, because it will know, you will have their name, you will have what rank they served at, what branch of the service they served in, and what military occupational specialty they had, and perhaps the address of a relative in the state. So where available, it's a valuable resource. We had to figure out how to give you the best available numbers across the board, regardless of what your State Department of Veterans Affairs has done. All right, so just as back here we noticed there were 282,000 separating service members as a national number, over here we saw that BLS estimates that there were 2,913,000 post-9/11 era veterans in the civilian labor force. Now, they took that. We can take those 2,913,000 and drop down to the state level, because BLS tells us how many of them are estimated to be in each state. When we take that state number of post-9/11 era veterans and divide it by 2,913,000, we know the proportion of post-9/11 era veterans in each state. You take those proportions and multiply it by that separations number, and you will get the approximation, allocation, estimate, or projection of separating veterans in 2015 in your state. And so that is where we come out. There's each of the MCMC states. There is the number of post-9/11 era veterans in your states, and for each of you there is at the one-digit level, the proportion, percent proportion, it's your share of the national total. So just for example, Illinois had 2.7%. That 79,000 is 2.7% of this 2.913, and when you multiply that percent times this 282,707, you get, whoops, no, you don't get a question. You get an answer, and there's the answer. So 2.7% of the veterans who separated, of service members who separated in 2015 is 7,655 separating service members. So I will close by saying, remember the words allocation, approximation, estimation, or projection. It's simply the best we could do. And what I would add is the data that Solid has prepared for MCMC takes each of your states down to the military occupational specialty level. So for Illinois, there is an Excel spreadsheet that will take those 2.7% of that. It will take those 7,655 putative separations and say, now that we've broken them out proportionally by state, if we give your state its proportion of each military specialty, here's what we would estimate would be the number in that military specialty in your state. Now, I would caution you, that's making assumptions that leap across 50 states, first of all, and then leap across 170 occupations, second of all, because obviously none of these percentages they are an exact percentage of the number of post-9/11 era veterans, but none of them are likely an exact percentage of the number of actually separating veterans. And when you take the further array of military specialties and apply, because in any given military specialty, the number can vary by year. One specialty can have a high number this year, a low number next year. So once we start talking about allocating at the military specialty level, obviously we're in a second zone of the best we can do. So I think the watchwords would be, we're happy to provide this data to you. We hope it is useful. It's the best available across the board. It's the best reasonable approximation that we can provide. And we hope it is informative to help you with the good work that you're doing. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Very good. So are there any other questions at this point? do we want, Sarah, or did you want to do a closing here, or? We do appreciate everybody.
Ed and Lisa, are there ways that other states, if they're interested in going about getting this information, should they work with you, or what can they do?
Well, that's a very good question. The occupation-specific information that we're providing was done based on a pretty in-depth analysis of the DoD data. If there was an interest in a state getting some occupation-specific data, the request would have to go through the Department of Defense, but we might be able to help facilitate that.
Thanks.
And Sarah, this is Ed. Did you mean if states outside MCMC wanted to do something similar, or did you mean if MCMC states wanted to take a deep?
Yes, so if we had somebody from Maine on the call or Washington State, did they contact you and work with you to get that sort of information?
We can definitely be a starting point for that, Sarah. So the information that was provided to MCMC, just for those folks not to be aware, was provided with approval from the Department of Defense. So MCMC actually met with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and explained their project and what they wanted to use the data for, and was given approval. So similar approval would need to be attained, but if anybody is interested in that, we can certainly help you get going in the right direction for that.
And just to add to Lisa's point about approval, the Department of Defense is careful. Data on strengths in various military specialties does have national security implications. So just for example, on this project, we were able to share with MCMC breakouts of strengths and separations for the healthcare MOCs, because DoD has generally concluded, well, it doesn't help our enemies much to know how many people we have in healthcare occupations. But in the case of other occupations, we weren't able to give strengths and separations at the military specialty level. Instead, what we did was provide the data at the ONET code level that the military specialty relates to, and usually there's more than one military specialty for any given ONET code. So basically, for the healthcare occupations, we were able to provide strengths and separations at the specialty and subspecialty level, whereas for the other military specialties, you could say it was a form of aggregated data. Having noted that approval is required and having noted that some restrictions apply, I think the Department of Defense wants to help states to do things like this. I mean, they frankly were impressed with the MCMC effort. They were eager because, and just since we have no questions, I'll just make a point that relates to the MCMC effort. Lisa and I were around in 2011, 2012 when there was a big national push that began to as Lisa said, this has been around for 20 years, but around 2011, 2012, the President and the Congress both put it up higher on the priority list, and both jointly and individually gave it a push. And when that happened, the first thing that happened was a lot of things inside the Beltway, things that the Pentagon did, things that the military services did, things that some of the federal agencies did. And so that was sort of the first generation of the recent initiatives. And the next generation was the Department of Labor entered into a contract with the National Governors Association to pilot state licensing in 6 states. So NGA ran a pilot for 1 year with 6 states that volunteered to pilot state-level licenses for service members and veterans, and there was a de facto emphasis on the healthcare occupations. Well, so now it was federal money, but it was at least trickling down to the state level to see, what could be accomplished at the state level, since that's where licensing really happens. Well, the MCMC has been the first instance of the third generation, because now we have the Lumina Foundation and USA Funds stepping forward and saying, well, we think the private sector should be pitching in here. And we have 13 states saying, well, we'd like to do something at the regional level. Well, I mean, for DOD, that's a huge win. For them, that means the money they spent early on was seed money. And now it's taking off on its own, and we have private money, and we have a regional consortium of people who've come together to do this, and so that's why, as Lisa said, this is really exciting. After 20 years of doing this, I mean, it's like with MCMC, we have achieved liftoff. So I'm quite sure that although permission would be required and restrictions would apply, and Lisa can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one can assume that a credible state or group of states would be given favorable consideration.
I think that's well said, Ed. And I wanted to point out, somebody asked in the chat window, how can we access a spreadsheet specific to our state, which might be what the question was that you were asking, Sarah. So just to clarify, the spreadsheets that we've provided the link to include the data by state for the MCMC states. And then, as Ed said, for other states, we would have to deal with that on a separate basis. I'd also wanted to reiterate something that Ed said with regard to the state numbers and how once you've sliced them and diced them a little bit, you end up with some rather small numbers. Please also keep in mind that the state tab on the MOCs to ONET's workbook is showing just separations in FY15. A lot of states should keep in mind that, any veteran could be considered, who's held that occupational area could be considered a potential target for these kinds of initiatives. So that increases the number. And then certainly there are active duty folks and Guard and Reserve folks in particular who may be seeking a credential while they're in the military who are also candidates. So in the broader spreadsheet that's not broken out by state, we do have the data showing for strengths as well as separations.
Yeah, and I should probably correct something that I said because, again, clarifying, for the healthcare, we do have by specific military occupation data at the strength, data on strength and separations down to military subspecialty. But Lisa, if I'm correct, when it comes to the non-healthcare occupations, we have the aggregated strength and separations by ONET code to which the military specialties correspond.
That is correct. So you can look and you can see the total number of folks who are in a military occupational specialty that equates to police patrol officers, the example I gave earlier. And then you can see on another tab all of the MOCs that would be rolled up into police patrol officers, that total number. What you don't see is for each one of those individual MOCs, you won't see the total number of strengths and separations, just to protect some of the DOD level data.
And I just brought that slide up.
Oh, thank you very much. Let's see. Yeah,
I just brought up the police patrol officer slide.
Yeah, so I was cross-referencing it to the spreadsheet, though. So in the spreadsheet that shows the breakout of all of this data, there is a tab that has ONETs and National Civilian LMI that shows that 13,693, and it shows it. And then there's also another tab that shows the MOC codes that would be related to that ONET code of 33-3051.01.
Right. So a state would know how many different military specialties were included in this category, and for this category, they would know the strength and separations for their state, estimated, allocated, approximated.
Yes, exactly.
This is Sarah.
I was going to say, Sarah, do you want to take that last question? Maybe?
Yeah. You can actually access this web spreadsheet on our website under resources, and it's the MOC to ONET spreadsheet, and it's tab number 4 that shows all 13 MCMC states. And you can take out the other states and just single years out, so you can really concentrate on your state as well. But those are on the website as resources. And we also had another question, and this one was, are other state compacts looking to replicate MEC's MCMC model? And yes, they are. One of our main metrics when we submitted our grant was to help other states, other compacts, kind of follow this model. So we have been in contact with those other compacts, and we should be having a conversation, I think, in September with SREB to talk about just military information in general. So we're looking forward to that. So you can always access our future and archived webinars at the link there. Not only do you have the PowerPoint slides, but you also have the audio, which is always nice as well. And if you want to join the conversation, we're on Facebook and LinkedIn, so feel free to join those. And if after today you start thinking if you have questions that didn't get answered, or you're looking at the spreadsheet and you have a question, please let me know. And if I can't answer it, I'm happy to reach out to Ed and Lisa and use their expertise.
And I would encourage people, if you use the spreadsheets, if you get into them, you're almost certain to have questions. And so I would encourage you not to sit and stew, but to ask Sarah. She's become extremely knowledgeable in a very short period of time. And for anything that she can't answer, we can certainly help her to answer. And it's in the work statement for all of us to help you do whatever you can do in this area. So we're truly happy to answer any questions, and would expect you would need to have some questions answered to put this data to good use.
Okay. Carla, Jennifer, any closing words from you?
I have none. I just think that the more information that we have on our website, the better, and we've obviously made the arrangements to do that, so that should help everyone.
I agree,
Right.
And I just want to thank Lisa and Ed. I think it was great information, and I really appreciate them sharing all of it with us today.
Thank you very much. It's been enjoyable, and please don't hesitate to ask additional questions through Sarah.
All right.
Well,
thank you all for awesome. Thank you all for joining us today, and again, look for future webinars on the MCMC webpage. Have a good day.
Thanks all.
Thanks.